Now let's check in with what business wants or expects from the government's economic response to the coronavirus. I'm joined now from the Sydney CBD by James Pearson, who heads up the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thanks for joining us, James. What are you expecting to get from the Federal Treasurer and Prime Minister when they announce their response this week?
Good to be on the show again, Chris. Look, we're hoping that the government will take some economy-wide stimulus measures. We've suggested, for example, that the sooner we can get the $2 billion of bushfire-related assistance off the table and into the pockets and hands of people who need it and will spend it, the better. We've also proposed to the government that they expand the tried and true and very popular instant asset write-off that incentivises small businesses in particular to bring forward their spending on capital equipment, and that'll stimulate demand in the business sector, but more broadly for the suppliers of the goods and services that'll be there. And more than that, I think the government should be thinking long and hard about bringing forward the tax cuts that have already passed the Parliament. So these are the personal income tax cuts and the small, medium and family-sized business tax cuts already been passed the Parliament, bring them forward, and that combination of measures could well go a long way to pump the economy at a time that it needs it.
What do you think of this idea that I highlighted earlier from Adam Crichton, that you could have a temporary, make it a 6-month or 1-year holiday from compulsory superannuation? There's a no cost to government means of getting more cash in the pockets of consumers.
Well, look, it's a pretty interesting idea, and the government has launched a far-reaching inquiry into retirement incomes, which obviously is going to be all about superannuation. So, look, I think we're going to have to wait to see what the recommendations from that inquiry are. That'll come out in a few months' time. I think what we need to focus on is measures, for example, that we learnt in the bushfire response and recovery effort can work really well, and that's around supporting small businesses in particular, directly and directly affected by a crisis, to keep their doors open, keep people in jobs. We can learn from the experience of the bushfires and scale that up economy-wide.
Yeah, but this idea of a temporary holiday on super, as I say, wouldn't cost government anything. It doesn't cost employers anything. It just gives people an extra 9 or 10% in their salary, which they can spend on something else if they like. If they want to still put it into their super, they can. It sounds like a pretty novel approach. I suppose the biggest worry would be that people wouldn't spend it, so then you don't get any bang out of that.
One of the interesting things, Chris, is that the last quarter's GDP figures showed that we were starting to see consumer demand ramping up, which means that the Reserve Bank interest rate cuts and the last round of personal income tax, people were no longer just putting it all into paying off the mortgage. They were starting to spend it in the shops. So, look, measures that will put more people, more cash into people's hands are welcome. On the subject of super, look, it's a highly contested area with a lot of vested interests. And it's interesting what you and Adam Crichton are saying, because it does point out that there is this linkage, isn't there, between superannuation payments and people's overall remuneration, the level of wages that they get. Look, I don't think the government's going to be looking in that direction. We're encouraging them certainly to look at measures that they already have on the table, that they've already road tested, get them out as quickly as possible, economy-wide measures, and maybe some specific targeted sectoral measures where they're warranted.
Now, one of the areas they'll really want to support is the tourism industry. Obviously, overseas tourism has been hit hard. It would be great if we could encourage more Australians to take holidays in Australia to bolster those areas. Some of it might even be in areas already hit by bushfire or drought. But this is sort of counterintuitive too, isn't it? Because it's not because of the coronavirus fears, people are probably less inclined to head off to holiday destinations mixed with a lot of other people.
Look, we had a meeting of industry leaders from right around the country last week on the New South Wales south coast in the beautiful town of Batemans Bay. And the reason we did that was because we wanted to demonstrate practical as well as symbolic support for just what you're talking about. Having a holiday, or in this case, having your corporate meetings in bushfire-affected areas in South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria. Those kind of measures, look, do make a difference. But there's another point you raise, and that is the uncertainty, even fear that people have about coming together in mass gatherings. I think it's time that we stopped getting mixed messages from medical authorities, from state, territory and federal governments around just what we should and shouldn't be doing in the community and certainly in businesses about our response to stay safe at a time when people are worried about the virus. So some clear, consistent messages so we hear the same thing from the federal health authorities as well as state and territory ministers. That'll give people running businesses much more confidence about what they do need to do and don't need to worry about doing as we all as a community come together to tackle this challenge.
I think as we've shown, highlighted, there's been some overreactions. It's surprising really we haven't seen a large communications campaign unveiled by the government, maybe just to give people this information. But I take from when you put together all the information they're putting out there, they expect, of course, that over time all of us will be exposed to this virus. It's not such a threatening thing that should worry us, but they certainly don't want everybody catching it at the same time and completely overwhelming our health system.
So I think that there's a debate going on internationally, not just nationally, about, I mean, for how long do you attempt to contain, and then when do you then manage the maybe almost inevitable spread of the virus? And the point you make is a good one in terms of the likelihood we're now being told that a great many Australians, a great many people around the world will at some stage be exposed to and get the virus. And that's why it's really important we don't have any more mixed messages from the different levels of government and the different health authorities across the country. Bless Australia, we have 8 states and territories and we have a federal government. It's really important they speak with one voice and they give very clear advice to the community more broadly and to people running organisations, including businesses in particular, so that the people we represent know what they should and shouldn't be doing and what they should and shouldn't be concerned about. I think that'll go a long way too to rebuilding some of that public confidence and getting rid of some of that fear that we've seen unfortunately breaking out in some quarters in recent days. Just on the economic management, I would have thought the biggest worry here would be that the federal government would overreact. I think there's a lot of history being rewritten now about 2009 when the Labor government overreacted. It was really China's resurgence and stimulus that kept Australia out of recession, and we ended up wasting stimulus billions for many years after the GFC had been. So I would have thought we need to be very careful and targeted here, but the question I have is what are other countries doing? What is China doing, for instance, in way of stimulus to ensure that its economy gets ticking over again? Because in the end, that's probably going to be the most important thing for us. The great challenge of this crisis is that we're seeing the impact on supply chains right around the world. China most obviously, but also northern Italy is a major supply centre for a large part of the industrial world. I would hope very much, and in fact I'd be confident, that the federal government would be talking very closely with its Chinese counterparts, its European Union and North American counterparts. The OECD is going to be a very important network of developed nations here, so there's a coordinated global response. This is, as Treasurer Frydenberg has said, this is not a liquidity crisis, which was what the global financial crisis was. This is a health crisis which has had an impact on supply and demand. But there's still the same number of people in the world and they still have the same wants and needs and aspirations. So the sooner we can unclog supply chains, get production going again and stimulate demand, then the sooner we'll be back on our feet. Thinking about Australia specifically, I think the government's task is to smooth out the inevitable volatility that we're going to experience over coming weeks and maybe months and get the economy back to running it as near as possible to full steam as soon as possible. I'm confident the government will approach its tasks very carefully. Certainly in the conversations that I've been having with them, that's a clear message I get.
Thanks for joining us, James.